I am here with former Premier of New Brunswick, Frank McKenna, former federal Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole. It's a pleasure to see you both. Thank you for taking time.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Mr. McKenna, I'll start with you. You've just walked out of that funeral. It was very moving, I guess, to say the least, service. What stuck out to you? What are you sort of going to think about as you leave?
The whole thing was moving. And it wasn't just being here at the service, it's the fact the whole country is in mourning for this great Prime Minister. But what really tore me up was listening to Caroline's daughter at the end, singing, and then Brian Mulroney in his own voice. There wasn't a dry eye in the church.
Yeah, I think Erin and Mr. O'Toole, anybody who has a grandfather or who loved their grandfather could relate to that moment. She was genuinely crying for the loss of her grandfather and her beautiful voice. And then when his voice came, wow.
That was so touching. And when she broke down a little bit and everyone in the church got behind her by clapping and told her, "We see you, we're with you in this morning," that was just so special. And I also thought, I haven't been as moved by a singing of O Canada in a while.
No.
We're still coming out of the pandemic days.
Yeah.
O Canada roared in that place, and you had all political parties, you had sovereignists, you had federalists, you had all there for a great Canadian, and gosh, that was a great national anthem too.
What was it like to be inside that room with the people who were there, as Mr. O'Toole points out? What a cross-section of Canadian society represented.
Well, like probably a few other people, I was wondering, what am I doing here? No, it was a cast of all-stars. It was amazing, and the fact that everybody came. I ran into people that I know from Vancouver, came in from Saskatchewan, Winnipeg. John Major came from London. It was amazing. But I do want to say one thing, because Erin's kind of alluded to it. Leave all of the other thousands behind. This is a beautiful family, and they were grieving for their dad. And we have a group in the Maritimes that we all love to death, the Rankin family, and they have a song, "In the faces of your children you rise again." And honestly, I felt like Brian Mulroney was rising again in the faces of those children and grandchildren.
They just moved through this week, Mr. O'Toole, with grace and class that I felt like when I was talking to other people who went in to pay their respects or had been watching on TV, they were actually having a proud moment as Canadians to see this family sort of representing us at this moment.
100%. And, when I was leader of the party, Rebecca and I, we drew inspiration from Brian and Mila and just how tight the family was and how they remained an important part of all of their children's life, their grandchildren's life, despite the challenges and the busy pace of politics or business. I think we can all learn a little bit from that. And for them to share these moments with the whole country, that service, ours in Parliament, in Ottawa, here in Montreal, it's been great to see a recognition as well of the legacy of Brian Mulroney at home and on the world stage, because I think he didn't always get his due in the first 10 years of a public life, and I think I saw a poll, 85% support what he did, and I think it's so nice for the family to get that support at this time.
It's also sort of fascinating, thinking about how different the sentiment was then. I remember as a kid, and I've said this before this week, my parents speaking, very strongly about what Brian Mulroney was doing. And now how many years later, the consensus, to Mr. O'Toole's point, that has formed around the consequence with which he acted.
Exactly. So just take one issue, free trade.
Yeah.
Right now, across the political spectrum, there's complete support for free trade. In fact, we spend most of our time trying to fight to make sure we keep it. Back then, he was really fighting public opinion in Canada when he went after the free trade deal with the United States. It was not easy selling it back home. And he did that, and he did something that we don't see much of, and that's create what I would call durable and continuing public policy. And that is public policy that will go beyond political parties and beyond generations and stay in existence and not get reversed with the next government that comes along. Sustainable public policy. And he's got two great examples, the consumption tax and free trade. And that's quite a miracle in this day and age.
Do you think it's fair to say, Mr. O'Toole, that it's harder to do that now? Is it harder? Do you think it is?
I think it is, because I tried to do it a little bit. And he was remarkably successful, but he expended a lot of political capital. And I think Caroline mentioned that.
Yes.
Several speakers mentioned that he wasn't in it for the short-term gain. As they said, good headlines in 10 days. He wanted solid policies for the well-being of the country in 10 years. And as Frank said, there were such good policies that even when the government of Jean Chrétien came in and several ministers had said we're going to cut the GST, they didn't. They saw that this was smart tax policy, it was making us more competitive. So when Brian left office, he left having done so much good that his own popularity was low. And it's nice now to see the legacy is he's one of our great post-war prime ministers, if not the greatest.
I think I hear a lot as well from people over the last week who felt that he kind of took Canada to a place internationally where it punched above its weight, that he didn't think in small terms. And I know that's a subject of interest to you both, particularly in your role as critic on foreign affairs for many years, and your role, of course, as an ambassador. What do you think his legacy in that respect is, Mr. McKenna?
Well, there's no doubt he was an equal in the group of seven. With Margaret Thatcher, with Ronald Reagan, he was their equal. And on apartheid, he literally led the world and pushed against some of those giants. On free trade, he had to push against prevailing opinion in Canada and in the United States, and he had to go toe-to-toe with Reagan on the question of the dispute resolution mechanism. One funny story just before I end, though. He told me about one of the G7s. It was his first one, and he was all goo-goo-eyed and everything. He said, all I really wanted was to get an autograph from these people, but I was embarrassed to ask. He said the meeting finished, Ronald Reagan put the menu down and said, would people mind signing this? And I'd love to have their autographs.
Wow, they're just like us. No?
Yeah.
Mr. O'Toole, your thoughts on that?
I wrote this week on my Substack, I joined the military in high school when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister. I didn't join because he was Prime Minister, but I joined because Canada in the world at that point, the Gulf War that Jean Charest talked about, that was a multilateral effort because of Brian Mulroney's influence on George Herbert Walker Bush. We not only, did the great work on apartheid, we were one of the leading nations to respond to the Ethiopian famine of the time. Mm-hmm. So on military, the only time in my lifetime we've reached 2% of spending was under Brian Mulroney. On aid, foreign aid, we were a leader. And on diplomacy, bringing countries and people together. He supported multilateralism at a time, we see populist trends moving away from multilateralism. I think all politicians of all stripes should take some lessons from Brian Mulroney, and hopefully that will be part of his legacy as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of nostalgia in the room and a lot of nostalgia around the country this weekend. Thank you both very much for making time to speak with us. I appreciate it.
Thank
Frank
you for having
McKenna
me.
and Erin O'Toole. Thank you.